Tom Carey investigates Roswell, and he probably does it better than almost anyone. He has authored and co-authored more than 30 published articles and a small library on the subject. Tom has appeared on Larry King Live, Coast to Coast AM with George Noory, and just about everywhere else. Tonight I have Tom in the studio, and we're going to talk about Roswell. That and more coming right up on My Alien Life. My Alien Life is recorded live from atop the Northern Rocky Mountains and is available on Spotify, Stitcher, iTunes, and everywhere fine podcasts are found. My website is at www.myalienlifepodcast.com. There you will find my email address, all previously recorded shows, and more. I am Cameron Brower. This is My Alien Life, and the podcast starts right now.
My Alien Life Podcast.
Three, two, one, zero, and liftoff.
Started working for MUFON as a state section director around Philadelphia, just to investigate some cases, right? Rather than just read about them, I wanted to investigate some. And around Philly, we didn't have very many cases. I joined QFOS, the Center for UFO Studies, out of Chicago. The old Alan Hynek started that, and they had a bi-monthly journal publication, and I read about these two guys, Kevin Randall, who I did an interview with yesterday, and Don Schmidt were teaming up to reopen. This is like 1990, 91. They're reopening the Roswell case because it had lain dormant since the first book came out in 1980, the Roswell incident, and the book had the subject had lain dormant. They were reopening it, and they wrote a few articles for the QFOS publication called the International UFO Reporter. So I said, "Wow, this is really interesting," because I did read the Roswell incident book and I liked it. I said, "Boy, this is like a real case, not like lights in the sky." So I called up Kevin Randall with my background in anthropology and archaeology. I called up Kevin Randall. I said, "What have you done about finding the archaeologists who allegedly had discovered the downed craft with the bodies?" He says, "Well, we interviewed one or two archaeologists in New Mexico, but they didn't know anything and we didn't go any further." I said, "Well, look, since the archaeologists were allegedly from the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia," I said, "let me go down to the university in Philadelphia and nose around." And they said, "Oh, well, have at it." So I called up William Moore, who was the co-author of the Roswell incident book, and I said, "Who were the archaeologists that you talked to for your book at the University of Pennsylvania?" And he gave me their names. One was a fellow named John Cotter, and another was his last name was Bales, B-A-I-L-E-S, Bales, something like that. So I went down there and interviewed them both. And Bales claimed he didn't know anything about it, never heard, don't know anything about it. Cotter knew all about it. And I said, "Wow, this guy really knows everything about the Roswell incident." But in the end, he said, "Well, you know what it really was?" I said, "No, keep going." He says, "It was a V-2 rocket with a chimpanzee aboard." I said, "Oh my goodness, I know it's not. Oh my." So I dropped it there, and the next week I went down to their library in the archaeology building. They have a building there dedicated to archaeology and anthropology. I went into their library and I looking up the certain archaeologist that they thought was involved. The guy named what was his? I can't remember his last name now. But anyway, I found a book by him, and it had his picture. And this was the guy that Stan Friedman was saying was the chief archaeologist out there in the field that stumbled upon the crashed UFO. And so I wrote down his name. They didn't have the dust cover on the book, but I wrote down his name. I wrote to the University of Kansas to get the book cover, dust cover, and the picture of this guy in the book was the one that Stan had done a identikit sketch, a forensic sketch about, and it was him. And so I called him up. He lived in New Mexico. He was a degreed archaeologist, and I wasn't there. I was over in Arizona doing work with at Fort Apache, et cetera, et cetera. So that was my introduction to actually working with Kevin Randall and Don Schmidt. This is 1991. Was finding the archaeologists who were allegedly at the crash site, and John Cotter was. I determined that later on that John Cotter, who did a lot of work at the Clovis site near Portales in New Mexico, he was at the site. He lied to me, but we had a number of pieces of information that put him there at the site. He died in 1999, so I wasn't able to confront him with it. And so that's 1991. I hooked up with Randall and Schmidt. Randall and Schmidt broke up in 1995. And in 1998, I'm on the board of directors at QFOS. Down comes Don Schmidt from Wisconsin down to Chicago, where we held our meetings twice a year. And Don said, well, he was going to New Mexico the next month, which would have been May of 1998. And he says, does anybody want to go with me? And one of the other fellows put up his hand. He says, well, right now it's 50-50. Well, somebody who tells you it's 50-50, that's a no. So I put up my hand. I said, Don, I'll go with you. So Don and I went down to New Mexico. It was our first trip together as a team. And we've been a team since May of 1998. So I don't know how many years that is, but that's, 27 years that we've been a team.
Let me just take 5 seconds here, though, because you mentioned him, and I want to mention who you are. If you know anything about UFOs or Roswell, my guest is Tom Carey tonight. Mr. Carey has researched, written, and lectured extensively about Roswell and is still at the forefront of research of an area that continues to get much attention after 72 years. So, Mr. Carey, thank you so much for joining me, and welcome.
My pleasure to be with you, Cameron. Just call me Tom.
Hey, how is Kevin Randall? You said you talked to him. I don't hear much from him, but I was just stumbled upon a video that I was looking at yesterday, and I was wondering about him.
Yes, well, we had been good friends right from the start, but we had a falling out about, let's say, 2015. It was my doing because I felt he had been overly aggressive in trying to disprove an initiative that we were putting together about a pair of slides that someone had brought forth that showed what to me looked like an alien body, one of the Roswell, and we had a falling out over that. It lasted until, what's this, August? It lasted until last month, by the way. We were both down in Roswell at the same time at the museum. and we were both speakers down there at the International UFO Museum and Research Center last month. And Kevin was sitting at a table about 20 feet away from me, facing me, and I was at the table and facing him. I'm thinking, well, this is not going to work. So Kevin came over and we shook hands, and at that point, I buried the hatchet. So we've been
when you have big personalities, well, not personalities, but you guys are all smart, Kevin and you and Don Schmidt. When you're researching, at this level, and there's obviously a lot of exposure and a lot of questions that are being answered, and you guys are the people that are in demand when somebody wants to know about Roswell. Have you always shared theories and questions, or has there been more of that in the past where you're competing or maybe even locking horns a little bit?
There is no sharing.
I've heard that,
there is no sharing. We're competing. We're competing entities. Even though we're all going in the same direction. Our work is our work, and Investigator X is Investigator X's work. There's no sharing because we put a lot of time and effort into this, and to say nothing of the money that we put into our research. And why give it away? If we weren't writing books, we would certainly no doubt share it. But we're all writing books, and we want to have material that's ours for our books. And that's basically, this goes for, in anthropology, there's very little sharing because Professor X wants to write a book, and Professor Y wants to write a book. So if they each have developed their own information or maybe their own theories, save it for the book. Don't share it with your competitor. That's the way life is, So that's the way it is, because we get the question all the time: why don't you just pool your information? Oh, right. We've spent almost 30 years on Roswell. We're going to share what we developed over 30 years with someone who hasn't put in 1/100th of the effort. I'm sorry, it doesn't work that way. And I'm just telling you how it is there, Cameron. It's very little sharing.
Well, I appreciate that, because I think that honesty is very important. And many of us, of course, feel that is the dysfunction of this functional group of people who are out there researching.
The only ones that behave this way, everybody does. You want to receive the fruits of your efforts. Why give it away to someone else who will just take credit for it? Or, you know what I mean?
It does happen in other disciplines too. Like you said, in anthropology, it happens, and it happens everywhere. So in science, it happens everywhere.
Yes. Every new theory has its critics. Charles Darwin, when the origin of species, boy, he took a lot of flack over that, and especially up front when new theories come out, that's where most of the attacks come. Even when the theories are correct, something new, especially discovered by somebody else. Oh boy, that's a blow to your ego. Why didn't I discover that? And that's the way a lot of people think.
So do you feel that you approached your research from a genuine skeptic point of view, or somebody who's extremely objective? And did you ask the hard questions? Because I'm going to ask you some questions that actually you've asked in the past. And I just want to know if you feel that you've asked the right questions and were extremely objective.
Well, I went into certainly Roswell after I read the book. I said, boy, there's something to this. So I went into it with a positive, not as Don Schmidt and Kevin Randall tell me that they went into their research as skeptics. But after interviewing some of the witnesses down in Roswell, we're talking about 1988 now, they went in as skeptics, but just interviewing some of the firsthand witnesses, they changed their minds. And it wasn't that they were planning to do that. That's what the witnesses convinced them that this was really something. And so I piggybacked on their research and the research that went into the first book, as I was positively disposed towards Roswell when I went into it, because to me it was saying something, but it didn't stop me or Don or Kevin from asking the critical questions. And after a while, if you interview enough people on a subject, you get a sixth sense about when they're making it up and giving you the real facts, and you develop that sense fairly quickly, and and it dictates that you ask certain questions. So I don't feel that we left any questions unsaid. Certainly, some witnesses died before we could get to them, and before we could do follow-ups. I had a witness here in Philadelphia who played for the Philadelphia Eagles. His name was Tom Brookshire. He was a defensive back, all-pro. His career ended early with a broken leg in 1961, but he was from Roswell, New Mexico, which I found out late. And so I called him up on the phone when I got back from Roswell and interviewed him for about 2 hours. And he gave me a lot of information over the phone, which turned out to be very helpful. And I had always planned to do a video interview of him, but he passed away rather quickly from cancer, and nobody knew he was sick. But he passed away within the year of gallbladder cancer. And I said, "Oh my goodness, I that's what I get for delaying what I wanted to do." So things like that.
Well, I think it's an odd thing that you go into this research and there are people dying. I mean, there was people who were involved in that investigation 70 years ago or even 60 years ago that were old then. And perhaps you felt like you're playing catch up this whole time and trying to get as much information from them as possible, because they did have a time limit. They were going to expire.
Of the hundreds of witnesses, first and second hand, over the years that we have interviewed, we're up to around 600 now. I can only think of 2 that are still alive.
Wow.
I can only 2 that are still alive. And I would have to call them tomorrow just to make sure that they are still alive. Yeah. Because look at it this way, Cameron, if you're 20 years old in 1947, you are 92 years old now.
Right. Absolutely.
So somebody 20 years old, for round numbers, would be 92 today if he's still alive. All of the officers are gone. There's no doubt that all the officers are gone. And I'm sure there's still a few out there, but just to give you some idea of what we're up against, I read recently that during World War II, and that's basically what we're talking about, is the World War II generation, the greatest generation. The United States had 16 men and women in uniform during the war. 16 million.
Right.
16 wouldn't have gotten us very far.
It would have been over quick.
We had 16 million men and women in uniform. Today, 2019, there are just a little less than 500,000 still living. And according to the Veterans Administration, we're losing 350 a day. So I did some quick mathematics, and that would mean that within 3 to 4 years, all of those would be gone.
Right.
All of the remaining would be gone. So as far as Roswell is concerned, that we're talking about just a few who still might be alive, and of those, how many would be capable of being interviewed? Because the diseases of old age, you name them, all kinds of maladies would preclude their being interviewed. So we have a book coming out next year. It's already at the printers. Don Schmidt and I, it's our 7th book that we've written together about Roswell. Book coming out next year called Case Closed. And the reason the case closed is that everybody's dead.
Right.
that were firsthand witnesses. So, we're only getting children and grandchildren now, even if we get those to interview. And so even some of the children are gone now, and even some of the grandchildren are gone now. So this case is, we're at the end pretty much. The only thing we're missing, like I said, it's a witness case. We have about 600 witnesses, first and second hand, that we have interviewed that have had information about the case. That doesn't mean everyone knew everything. Everyone only knew their own little snippet of what they knew about the case. It's been our task to put those, like a jigsaw puzzle, put those little snippets together into a timeline jigsaw puzzle that makes sense. And we believe we've already done that. The only thing we're missing is an artifact, a piece of physical evidence. That is the only thing we are missing. We know that there are pieces out there. The military didn't get everything because we've been out to the crash site many times, and it's very windy out there. The pieces of wreckage that came to Earth after the ship exploded were very, very thin and light, and they certainly flew all over the place. And I'm sure the GIs, being GIs, they didn't get everything. So one of these days, somebody's going to find a piece out there, or we know some of the ranchers who got to the site first pocketed souvenirs. We know some of the ranchers have pieces. Maybe one of those will come forward, but that's our hope. We've had several archaeological digs out there. The biggest one was done in 2002, supervised by the University of New Mexico's Office of Contract Archaeology, and we had it was a regular Ph.D. archaeologist headed it up, and of course I was there, and Don Schmidt was there, and we had volunteer diggers out there, and we dug at the main crash site, but we didn't find any pieces of the ship because that was the site where most of the wreckage had come to rest and that the Air Force concentrated on in cleaning up. And if a piece comes to light, it's not going to be from that site. It's going to be from the periphery or even far away, maybe a mile or two, that the wind, you should know this from your archaeology, they call them aeolian deposits, windborne.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Windborne deposits. And it'll be something like that, or a rancher or some former military person comes forward. Well, folks, I've had a piece all these years, and I've kept it to myself, and here it is. That's how it's going to arrive, hopefully someday.
So were any limits put on that last excavation that you said it was in 2002?
That was the big one, yes.
So what type of dig was that? Did they actually, was it anything goes? Obviously you don't have the time or the resources to spend as much as you need to, but how'd that work?
Right. Well, it was sponsored by the Sci-Fi Channel. They paid for everything, and we were a lot of volunteers from all over the country signed up, but only about 15 showed up, and so we were undermanned considerably, which cut into how much land we could actually investigate. We did slip trenches, maybe 6 inches to 8 inches deep, because we're talking about something that fell to Earth, 2002, that's 60 years. I don't know if that's 55, 60 years after the fact. So we didn't have to go down that far. We didn't find any pieces of the ship, but we found what we thought was one of the gouges that the ship had skipped across the desert floor and cut a gouge. We think we found that, but we didn't find any pieces. And like I said, that was we in the last day, because we didn't have enough diggers. We brought in a what do you call those scoopers? The machine with the
you did
big
some
arm.
backhoe work, some excavator and backhoe.
Yeah, the archaeologist's favorite tool, the backhoe.
That was my favorite tool.
So we brought him in, and he cut across the alleged gouge crease at right angles, and we believe we found the gouge. We saw the aeolian deposits formed a perfect V in the ground. So that was our biggest find. But we've been out there a couple of times since on our own with, Radio Shack type metal detectors. And there's a fellow out there who lives in Roswell. He's been out there a couple of times on his own without our knowledge or permission, and claims to have found some little pieces of what looked like, to me, aluminum. And I know from the witnesses there were no pieces that small. That he's found little pieces maybe an inch long, and they're, to me, they look like pieces of a gum wrapper that had been somebody threw away, or a piece of a metal container of some sort. But he says they've been tested and they'd have funny readings, that, they're something that couldn't have been made on this planet. I personally don't believe it, but that's my opinion. So that's what we've done archaeologically speaking. But like I said, I think we're not going to find what we're looking for that way. It's going to have to be something fortuitous. Somebody out in the desert for some reason, camping or something, and trips over a piece or sees something strange and happens to be a piece of this ship, or one of the military people, or one of the ranchers. It's going to be from one of those sources.
Is it still a ranch? I mean, are there still people working? Is there cattle out there? What's out there? What's happening?
The crash site itself is on private property, but it's totally surrounded by Bureau of Land Management, federal land, yes, federal or state. So in order to get to the crash site, you have to, which is private land, you have to cross federal land. But, to get there, you have to have the permission of the owner who owns the property. Don Schmidt and I have permissions as long as we let them know. But these people that show up unexpectedly, they don't have permission, and they're if they're found, they're taken off. They take them away. I mean, remove them from the property. So, and we've had people try to salt the site with nails and things, and metal things. You'd be surprised what goes on. It's people trying to thwart what it is you're doing. Makes you wonder, don't they have enough to do in their life? So.
If you wanted to, let me ask you this: if you wanted to convince someone that there was a UFO crash at Roswell, and you could pick any three pieces of evidence that exists to persuade them, what would they be?
Well, they're all dead now.
You're talking about people.
You mean of ones that we interviewed?
Well, just any piece of evidence that we have. I mean, what do we have that? I know we have people, and they're soon all to be gone. But
yes, what I would suggest is they read our first book, Witness to Roswell. We've had so many people say I was on the fence, or I didn't believe until I read your book. Now I'm convinced. So I would say read our first book, Witness to Roswell, and read our current book. This is where I get my plug in for our book. Read our current book, UFO Secrets at Wright-Patterson, Eyewitness Accounts from the Real Area 51. Now, when I give talks, I'll ask the audience, how many of you have heard of Area 51? And most of all their hands go up, right?
Right.
Then I'll say, well, how many of you heard of Wright-Patterson? And very few hands go up. Well, Wright-Patterson was Area 51 before there was an Area 51. That was the brainchild of the Air Force. That's where all the back engineering took place. That's where all the foreign technology was investigated. That's where all the new aircraft were developed before Area 51 in Nevada came into being. So I would say read Witness to Roswell, still available at Amazon. And our new book, which came out in May, it reached number 2 on Amazon, and they're all UFO books sold in the world. It reached number 2. The number 1 book I never heard of, so I don't know what's going on there. But it reached number 2. And it's about the secrets that took place at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio, which is where all the alien artifacts were stored, where they were analyzed, where all the research was done prior to the development of Area 51 in Nevada. We think the alien artifacts, Senator Barry Goldwater tried to get into what they call the Blue Room at Wright-Patterson. We have a whole chapter on that. We have a whole chapter on the famous Hangar 18, which everybody seems to have heard about. We have a whole chapter on how that came about and what hangar it really is. But Barry Goldwater, when he was a senator from Arizona, most people don't know that he was also a Reserve Air Force Major General, 2 stars. And so he's a senator in charge of the Senate Armed Services Committee in 1963, tried to get into the Hangar 18's Blue Room, where he says he called up the Air Force Chief of Staff, General Curtis LeMay at the time. He said, General, and they were good friends, LeMay and Barry Goldwater. He said, General, I hear you have a room here in Wright-Patterson. I'm here now. That has a lot of this, the UFO remains and wreckage and things like that. Might I go in that room, General? And Barry Goldwater, he told this story on the Larry King show. He said, LeMay, it was the only time LeMay ever got mad at him. He said, LeMay cursed him up one side and down the other. He said, no, you can't go in that room. Hell no, you can't go in that room. I can't go in that room, which I don't believe. And if you ever ask me that again, I'll see that you're court-martialed. Well, thank God they were friends, right? So Goldwater dropped the subject at that point.
He's pretty.
That was 19.
That was what year?
I'm sorry, that was 1963.
Right. He's a pretty remarkable guy. I mean, he had a brilliant military career as a pilot. I guess he had flown over, I don't know, it was like 150 different types of aircraft and even the B-52 Stratofortress and later in his career. And so he had a lot of military experience. So it's really surprising, or not surprising rather, that he wasn't allowed there as well.
Yeah, he wore 2 hats. He was a elected U.S. senator, very respected on both sides of the aisle, unlike today. He was also wore the Air Force hat of a major general. And he was friends with the commander of the Roswell base at the time of the incident, formerly colonel, but later he wore 4 stars, General William Butch Blanchard. That's where he heard about the Roswell case, was from his friend General Blanchard. And so when one trip to Wright-Patterson, he said, well, I've heard about this Blue Room here, and I'd like to see because Goldwater was a ham radio operator, and he was also a UFO buff. He was a UFO buff from way back, and so he tried to get into the Blue Room to see that stuff for himself, and he was turned down. And if you're going to turn down Barry Goldwater, who are you letting in? So that's in our book, and it's one of those interesting stories that he told on national television. So
when the military and the government are able to keep secrets so long, I mean that's miraculous in itself. And you and Don wrote a paper, and I'm not sure when this was, but you had asked the question, and I'm wondering if you have an answer now. How could such a monumental event, such as a UFO crash in 1947, be kept a secret so long? You know, how and why does that happen?
Well, it hasn't been kept secret.
Well,
it's been leaking.
Yeah, bits and pieces.
To answer your question, we deal with that in the book. There were three target audiences that they had to contain. The first one was the national press, because the first story that went out, and there's arguments about the first story that went out that said it was that the Roswell Army Airfield had captured a flying saucer. That's the term they used. That headline, once it got on the news wires, went around the world. And we argue about whether that was a local faux pas or that was a designed way of handling the story, because the next day the story had been retracted, that it was not a flying saucer, but the airmen, the officers and airmen at the Roswell, which was a SAC base, the only atomic equipped bomb group in the world that ended World War II in Japan by dropping the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, was the 509th Bomb Group in Roswell, that they somehow couldn't tell the difference between a spaceship from another world and a radar target, a tinfoil and rubber weather balloon with a radar target attached to it. They couldn't tell the difference, is what the news story was. It was a weather balloon, not a flying saucer. And that was good enough for the media, because they dropped the story cold turkey right then. It was a 2-day story back in 1947, July 8 and July 9. It was a flying saucer one day, a weather balloon the next day, end of story. So the press was taken care of. The next group that had to be taken care of was the military people on the base, the Roswell base. We're talking like 10,000 people on the base or more. And of course, they were all buzzing about, and especially those who had been out to the crash site came back telling stories of seeing little people, little aliens, and all sorts of things. So the officers were easy to handle, because, officers are, what do you call them? I'm an officer and a gentleman. So the officers were easy to handle, because they appealed to national security and things like that. And but the enlisted men, they were all herded together in the various units and threatened with prison in Leavenworth if they wanted to talk about it, or if they didn't keep silent about it. They all had to sign non-disclosure agreements, but they were also threatened with Leavenworth if they didn't stop talking about it. And that was pretty much those two things, the non-disclosure agreement and the threat of jail time, was enough to diminish the enlisted ranks from discussing it further. The one group that also had to be silenced had no direct authority. I mean, they were not under the direct authority of the military, were the ranchers that got out to the crash site prior to the arrival of the military. Because the ranchers, they knew that something had crashed. They heard it the night before. They heard the explosion, and they got out there first And we've interviewed some of those. Most of them were from the Corona area rather than Roswell. And they were threatened with their lives. They weren't threatened with prison. They were threatened with their lives if they wanted to talk about the crash and what they had seen, because a number of them had gotten to the site. They saw the wreckage. They saw the little bodies, and they knew that they weren't from Texas. And so they were threatened with their lives.
Have you ever heard of any other situation occur where witnesses were threatened with their lives and somewhere other than Roswell? Because I haven't.
Off the top of my head, I would say no. I'd have to think really hard about it. But right off the top of my head, there's never been another situation like this where people were threatened with their lives if they talked. And you know, the military only has authority over civilians in time of war or when martial law has been declared, and neither one obtained in this particular incident. And this weather balloon explanation, around the time of the Roswell incident, there were 4 or 5 other weather balloons that had come down. One in New York State, upstate New York, one in California, one in Circleville, Ohio, and none of them produced a Roswell type scenario where the military rushed out there and with a lot of soldiers to cordon off the area and things like that, and people threatened. It never happened in those cases.
Did the military ever provide an explanation why they didn't go out there for a recovery before the actual material was discovered by Mr. Brazel?
They went out as soon as they heard about it.
You'd think they would have known about it and then, you know, maybe beat Mr. Brazel to the side.
Well, if it was one of ours, they would have known about it, but it wasn't one of ours, so they didn't know about it. And way out in that desert area, you can see for 50 miles around, and there wasn't anybody looking.
Right, but assuming that they were, you know, if they said it was a radar device, a test device, and it was floating out there in the middle of the desert, you would think that they would have arrived shortly after it would have crashed to contain the area or something.
What they claimed was in 1994, the Air Force changed their story that it wasn't a weather balloon, it was this Project Mogul, which was a series of balloons, which carried aloft. They were launched from Alamogordo, New Mexico, starting in the summer of 1947. It was a number of weather balloons tacked on one after another. And what it was supposed to do was take a listening device, an acoustic sensor, up into the atmosphere, stratosphere, whatever you call it. There's one level up there which carries sound very well. And the idea was to put these acoustic sensors up and keep them up at a constant level, listening in for what they believed would be the first atomic device detonated by the Soviet Union. They thought that was was coming along, that they wanted to listen in on it. And it wasn't actually until 2 years later that the Soviets actually detonated their first atomic bomb. But Project Mogul was to send these balloons up carrying a microphone, a acoustic sensor, keep it up there, and if it came down, there were instructions on this array where to take the who to contact to have them come out and pick it up. Well, they claim that this certain launch from June 4th, they never found, and they claim, that must be what they found at Roswell, because we never did recover it. And so if you ask them today, that's what they'll tell you. It's this June 4th launch of one of these balloons devices that they never, because they actually scrubbed the test because of the cloud cover. So they took the acoustic sensors off and just let the balloons go. And they claim, well, that must be what they found at Roswell, all these balloons and radar targets. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous because it would have come down in a day or two, and the ranchers, they were sheep ranchers out there, and sheep will eat anything, and they would not allow something like that to stay out there because it would, the sheep would eat anything, and if they swallowed some of this rubber balloon stuff, they would choke. And so that story is just so phony on so many levels that it just doesn't hold water.
One thing I wonder about that is why, after 45 years, did the government and the military feel that they needed to provide some sort of explanation at all? Why couldn't they have just ignored it? What happened?
Here's the reason. Was that in 1980, you had the first book, the Roswell Incident. Unfortunately, it was another 10 years before the second book came out. But also in 1980, you remember that show called In Search Of?
Yeah.
It was a half-hour show by Leonard Nimoy, who played Dr. Spock on Star Trek. And in one of the shows was totally devoted to the Roswell crash. Now, this was 1980, the same year that the book came out. 1980 was also the same year that a picture called Hangar 18 came out, which was about a hangar. In this case, it was in Texas, where a crashed UFO was stored. It starred the man from U.N.C.L.E., what was his name? Robert Vaughn, Gary Collins, and somebody else I can't remember. So you had that going on, but 10 years went by. But the first book by Kevin Randall and Donald Schmidt, who had hooked up in 1988 to reopen the Roswell case, the first book came out in 1991 by those two, and that really lit the fire. That because it had so much more information, detailed information about the Roswell crash than the first book in 1980 by William Moore and Charles Berlitz. And that book, considering the TV shows, and I left out, there was a TV show called, Robert Stack was the host, Unsolved Mysteries. Remember that?
Mm-hmm. You bet.
In 1989, September of 1989, the first show of the new season was devoted to Roswell. This is 1989. And Randall and Schmidt are already at work on the case. So you have that Unsolved Mystery show devote the whole show to the Roswell case. Randall and Schmidt's new book comes out in 1991 called UFO Crash at Roswell. And the fire, for some reason, it really caught fire where the first book didn't, it sort of had a cult following. Wasn't a bestseller, but this new book just caught fire, and it was so popular that the book was optioned, and it became a movie in 1994, a Showtime movie called, the Roswell Incident. So you had these TV shows, and then the motion picture called Roswell in 1994. And by this time, the word Roswell had become known around the world. You go anywhere in the world, say Roswell, they'll know what you're talking about. They know that something happened there about a flying saucer. They might not know all the details, but they know the term Roswell has something to do with that. So the interest is now high, and there was a congressman from New Mexico named Stephen Schiff. He was asked by some of his constituents to try to find out what happened to all of the telexes and the the things that pass back and forth between Roswell, the Roswell base, and say their next higher command in Fort Worth, Carswell Air Force Base, and Carswell and Washington. They wanted to know what happened to all those telexes that went back and forth about this. And so Stephen Schiff he tried to get some information from the Department of Defense, and they said, oh, we don't have anything. Go to the National Archives. So Stephen Schiff goes to the National Archives and says, why did they send you here? We don't have anything. So he said, well, they're giving me the runaround. So he tasked the General Accounting Office, which is the investigative arm of Congress. It's now called the General Accountability Office. Back then it was the General Accounting Office. He charged the General Accounting Office to look into the documents that were developed during the Roswell incident to find out if they were properly classified and stored and handled correctly. Well, surprise of surprise, it turned out all of the documents had been destroyed by unknown authority. Now, having been in the Air Force myself, I know that you can't go to the bathroom without authority. You need an authority for everything. But the destruction of all the Roswell documents, however many there were, disappeared. They had been destroyed by parties unknown. And that in itself is that just heightens the mystery. So the Air Force at this time, they said, oh, what we're going to do to try to set people's minds at ease is we're going to conduct our own investigation of the Roswell case. And so what they did is they cherry-picked a few witnesses. I mean, there were so many witnesses. They cherry-picked a few that said, well, nothing happened, or it was a weather balloon and things like that. Some of the Air Force officers who, were actually lying, and they came out with this report in 1994. Really, what it was supporting the so-called Mogul explanation, Project Mogul. So they just bought into the Project Mogul explanation in 1994, but they didn't explain the little bodies that were said to have been found. And so they did that in 1997, right before the 50th anniversary of the event, the big celebration in Roswell. They came out with another book called Roswell, the Roswell Report, Case Closed. And this really gets bizarre. They said that the little bodies that people reported seeing back in 1947 were really these dime store mannequins that they tested in the 1950s in Project High Dive. They would take a plane up to 100,000 feet and drop this parachute with a dime store dummy on it to test the effects of high altitude parachute drops. And but sir, those took place in the 1950s. How could that have anything to do with Roswell? Oh, well, they explained that by saying, well, when you get old, a lot of people suffer from something called time compression. You tend to ascribe a different time to something from when you actually witnessed it. So, and this apparently only affected the Roswell witnesses because they never used it for anybody else. So they said it's because they saw these. They were out in the desert in the mid 1950s, and they came upon these dime store mannequins. But due to time compression over the years, they said that it was back in 1947. So it was time compression. Well, the Air Force officer giving this press conference, they laughed him off the stage. he finally said, "Well, I'm not going to say any more about it. That's all I have to say. Goodbye." The media, who is programmed not to believe anything about flying saucers, they just laughed this guy off. It was so bizarre and so unlikely an explanation that they just laughed at him, and he closed his little book there and left the stage. The Air Force has, that's 1997, the Air Force has not commented since on the Roswell incident.
Another question I have is, do you think that Mac Brazel was part of the cover-up? Because he had made a statement, and it's interesting to me that he made a statement that, or maybe somebody made the statement for him, but weather balloons had fallen onto his ranch on a number of occasions, and that he had turned those in for rewards that are offered. So it wasn't unusual for him to do that. But to me, it seems it would be very unusual to have multiple weather balloons fall on a ranch that, somebody like that would find. And did that really happen? Who said that? And what does that mean? Did somebody put words into his mouth?
You got it partially right. The ranchers were used to having weather balloons fall on their ranches because the 509th Bomb Group would send them up all the time, because the bombers, every time a bomber went up, they had to know which way the winds were blowing. So they were used to seeing and collecting the weather balloons. In fact, on the Brazel Ranch, there was something we call the Spanish well, where they used to just throw the weather balloons down the well. It was an abandoned, a water well. And they would throw the weather balloons down the water well because, they didn't come after them, and they didn't want them laying around because the cattle would eat them. So they would throw them in the water well. And unfortunately, we believe that the GIs, when they were cleaning up the site, we believe they threw some of the pieces of the wreckage down there, but the whole well has been cemented over, so we can't get down there. But the Mac Brazel, the Air Force, once they realized what they had, a spaceship from another world, plus a few bodies, and the Brazel had already come into town and given the story to the sheriff and to an announcer at the radio station KGFL. Once they realized what they had, they put out an APB, "We got to get Brazel. We got to get him. We don't want him going around talking about this." So they found him on the morning of July the 8th because he had come back into town to do some work, and he stayed over. No, he was the owner of the radio station KGFL. Once they heard about this and they heard that Brazel had called one of their announcers out at his ranch, they drove him back. They kept him at the station owner's residence overnight. And the military by that time were looking for him, and they found him the next day, Brazel, that is. So they grabbed Brazel, took him back to the base, kept him at the guest house, and they worked him over until they got him to change his story. They threatened him, and we only found this out this year. They threatened him not with his life, but with putting him in an insane asylum. They threatened him with putting him in an insane asylum, as they did put the announcer for KGFL. They actually did put him in an insane asylum, kept him over in Texas in a hospital, insane asylum, for a year until the case blew over. But they threatened Brazel with that if he didn't change his story and tell them it was a weather balloon. So he goes to the Roswell Daily Record, which carried the big headline the day before, RAAF, and that's not the Royal Air Force or the Royal Australian Air Force, that's the Roswell Army Airfield, captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region. He goes to the newspaper and he tells this story that he found this weather balloon on June the 14th. He kept it in a shed, but he didn't get to go into town until July the 6th. So he tells this story that he's sorry he told about it. There's nothing to it. But in the last paragraph, he takes it all away. He says, I know one thing. I know whatever I found was no high altitude weather device, because I've found weather balloons many times on the ranch. And if I ever find anything short of an atomic bomb, I'm not going to report it. It will only be like an atomic bomb that I'll report. I'm not going to report anything else. So he takes the whole article away. The article's called "Harassed Rancher Sorry He Told About His Find," and he tells the whole Air Force story, what they told him to say. But in the very last paragraph, he takes it all away by saying what he found was no weather observation device of a weather balloon, and if it's anything other than a atomic bomb, he's not going to report it. He's sorry that he reported it. So you were partially right, but that's how it went.
Did the military really hire local Roswell morticians to make child-sized caskets?
Yes. They called up what's his name, Glenn Dennis. He later became a mortician, but back in 1947, he was an embalmer.
Right.
So he took phone calls, and they wanted to know if they had any child-sized caskets available. And he said, "Well, we have one, but I can order as many as you want. I'll be here tomorrow." And so, the Air Force officer hangs up, and then he calls again later. He says, "How do you preserve biological tissue that's been out in the desert for a while?" So he, Dennis is an embalmer, so he can answer that. And finally, he says, "I'm sorry, sir. Have you had a crash? I can be right over there and see what you need." And the guy says, "Oh, no. This is all hypothetical in case we have a crash," and that ended it. But he did order more caskets for Amarillo, Texas, and they were ordered by an outfit that their building was next door to Ballard's Funeral Home, where Glenn Dennis worked. It was a mortuary supply place, and so they sent somebody to Amarillo, and they did get a couple of caskets brought back, child size. So that story is true.
The hypothetical crash scenario.
Yeah, the officer, when Glenn Dennis offered to come out personally to see what they needed, he's, "Oh, no, don't come out. This is all hypothetical." The rest of Glenn Dennis's story, we believe, is false. That he made it up about the nurse. That he the next day he met his girlfriend nurse at the officers club, and she told him that she had been part of an autopsy, and the bodies stunk so badly that they had to stop because everybody was getting sick. We believe he heard that story from another embalmer whose wife was a nurse, who actually was called out to the base with her superior, her boss, who was a doctor. They were civilians, and that's a long story, but we were able to piece that together. That the rest of Glenn Dennis's story he got from another embalmer there, and he made it his own when he went on the television for Unsolved Mysteries a couple of shows after the original Roswell airing. So that's what we believe anyway.
Right. So we have a crash, and obviously there's going to be an inventory of evidence. What does that timeline look like for locations of this evidence? Where did it travel first, and over the years, where did it end up, and how many different places did it end up? Any idea?
Oh, absolutely. Does a bear go to the woods?
I knew you'd
I
have an
think
answer. That's why you're here tonight.
yes. We believe there are three crash sites involved. The first one is when the ship blew up late on the evening of July the 2nd, 1947. We have witnesses to that. The ship, we believe, was struck by lightning because the July is called the monsoon season in New Mexico. Heavy thunder and lightning storms, oftentimes without rain, but just thunder and lightning. And if it wasn't an internal explosion, it was, we believe, struck by lightning, and it blew the outer shell of the craft apart. And that's when all these little pieces rained down on the Brazel Ranch. And that we call the debris field site. That's where we did our archaeological digs. That's on the Foster Ranch that Mac Brazel was the foreman. We believe the inner cabin or some sort of an escape capsule continued on for another 30 to 35 miles before it came to rest much closer to Roswell. And we believe that when the ship exploded, two of the occupants were thrown out and landed on a low bluff 2.5 miles east of the debris field. We call that the D. Proctor body site because it was D. Proctor who showed his mother. D. Proctor was with Mac Brazel when he found all this stuff, and he was with Mac when they found these two bodies on this low bluff 2.5 miles east of the Foster Ranch. So there's two sites, the debris field site, the body site, and then the capsule or inner cabin, when that came to rest, it's much closer to Roswell. We call that the final impact site, where the remainder of the ship finally came to rest. Now, with that inner cabin, there were two dead occupants, and one still alive that was walking around, according to a civilian witness. So those are the three sites. Everything was transported to the Roswell Army Airfield, which later became Walker Air Force Base, just south of the city of Roswell. Everything went there into the big hangar. The hangar's still there. It's now, back then it was called Hangar P as in Fall 3. It's now called Building 84. It's still an operating hangar on the old base. And so everything goes there. Now, from there, some of the wreckage, the ultimate destination was Wright Field or Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. That's the ultimate repository. But some of the wreckage and some of the bodies stopped over in Fort Worth on their way there so that they could show the next higher command, the 8th Air Force, with the 8th Air Force Command, and the commanding general was Roger Ramey. So some of the stuff stopped there for a while and then continued on to Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio. So those are and we think that some of the wreckage, because we believe all the bodies went to Wright Field, some of the wreckage went to Los Alamos, some of the wreckage went to Alamogordo, it may be one or two other places, but most of everything went to Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio. We believe it stayed there until the early 1980s when it was transferred to Area 51 in Nevada. And in 1996, there was a lawsuit filed against the facility. The government refused to call it Area 51, but it was the facility in Area 51 because they burned hazardous waste there in open pits, and a lot of people got sick that worked at Area 51, so they filed a lawsuit against Area 51. And Bill Clinton, for the first time, they admitted that there was a facility there. He didn't call it Area 51, they just said it was a facility. And when that lawsuit took place, we believe a lot, if not all of the wreckage went to Dugway in Utah. It's like an Area 51 type secret place. We believe the Roswell bodies are still there in Dugway in Utah, the old Dugway proving grounds, just like Area 51 during World War II was a proving ground for aircraft and target practice and things like that. And so that's 1996. And where is the stuff today? We believe the Roswell bodies are still at Dugway in Utah, but that the physical wreckage is now all in private hands. And by private hands, I mean big companies that have large government contracts. They're private contractors like Lockheed Martin, the big, some of the Lawrence Livermore laboratories, Oak Ridge, Tennessee. We believe that all the wreckage, not only from Roswell, but all the UFO stuff is now in private hands, so they don't have to respond to Freedom of Information requests. Rand Corporation, that's another one. That's there's stuff definitely there, and Lockheed Martin. So that's where we believe all the UFO stuff, including the Roswell stuff, is now being stored.
So do you think they're analyzing the materials, these private companies, so basically using the technology? Is that part of it?
Yes, they started doing that right away. Battelle Memorial Institute in Columbus, Ohio, just down the road from Roswell, from Wright-Patterson is in Dayton, and Battelle Memorial is in Columbus. They started working trying to re-engineer this so-called memory metal. This is the wreckage, and there was a lot of it, of these little pieces, very thin, light, indestructible, but that you could wad up in your hands into a ball, open your hand, and it would just float out and go back to its original shape. They tried to re-engineer that, and they were successful to a degree. They didn't quite get it all the way to the original, but it's called nitinol. It's spelled Nitinol. The Ni stands for nickel, the Ti stands for titanium, and the NOL stands for the Naval Ordnance Lab, who in 1962 announced the development of this memory metal type of amalgam. The Battelle Memorial Institute didn't want to be they didn't want their name associated with anything that had to do with the UFOs, so the results were laundered through the Naval Ordnance Lab, and they announced it in 1962. You can go online, just put nitinol in your browser and see what comes up. It's on sale. You can buy it by the sheet. You can buy it by the roll. You can buy it by the coil. You name it, you can buy it. But that has its roots in the Roswell memory metal that they immediately started back engineering. We also hear, as far as the wreckage itself, and this gentleman has since passed away, that he was there in the big hangar in Roswell when they brought all this wreckage in. He says, I was there, and so help me, there wasn't a moving part on it. And he said, before I pass away, and he was in his 80s when he came to us, he said, I want to know how that thing flew, because there wasn't a moving part on it. Well, we finally came to a conclusion that somehow the memory metal was the motive propulsive force of this disc. It was a flying disc, but we didn't know how it actually did it. Well, we have heard since, and unfortunately the gentleman died. He passed away before we were able to get to him with this information, even though he did live in Roswell. We have heard since that, and we suspected this all along, that it'd be like giving Christopher Columbus a television and asking him to reproduce it. He wouldn't know he wouldn't know what it was, how to make it. Maybe he would see the picture there, but he wouldn't know how to make it. They still don't know how the thing flew. They still don't know how to back engineer it to make it work. They just don't know. They haven't. Well, these 72 years now, they still don't know. That's what we heard.
So in these cases, element 115 obviously not involved.
Element 115, that sounds like Robert Lazar, am I right?
Well, it is. And, it's the only probable propulsion system that's really out there. But, I do think that that's interesting with the memory metal and its ability. I mean, obviously there's something there, and there's something that is to be learned. I want to know, if we're actually using this. I mean, obviously we've gotten some engineering out of some engineering use out of some of these parts that we found, but what else?
Yeah, I'm straddling the fence on Robert Lazar.
Me too.
So anything that he has said, I take with a grain of salt. I can be convinced one way or the other. Right now, I'm straddling that fence. Element 115, I did see something about that recently, but I think it's something he said he was aware of or working on, and then one of these shows on TV talked about its development. I quite frankly, I don't know any more than that.
Yeah. I'm not even on the fence on that one, so I'm not really willing to comment too much about it, but it's an interesting thing nonetheless. How many other crashes in that time period in the late 40s do we know about?
Well, we have a witness. She worked at Wright-Patterson for 10 years, from 1942 to 1952. She's in our book. Notice I keep plugging our book. And she had a Q clearance, which was higher than top secret, which enabled her to. She was a clerk typist, which cleared her to take dictation from the highest people with the highest security clearance. And one of those was a gentleman named Wernher von Braun, the father of our space program. Came over in 1945 with paperclip Germans, and they had developed their V2 project over there in Germany during World War II at Peenemünde. And so a group of them came over. They were kept at a base, an army base in Texas, Fort Bliss. And they were brought into when this thing crashed, they were brought into the crash site to identify not, and it certainly wasn't Russian. So, but von Braun became the father of our space program. He was a rocket expert. And in 1952, this woman, her name was, oh my goodness, I've got so many names rolling around in my brain. June, I forget her name, but she was working at Wright-Patterson, taking dictation from Wernher von Braun, and she asked him, and von Braun said that up until 1952 that he knew of 3 UFO crashes, 3. The only one she remembered was Roswell. That was the only one she remembered him naming. The other 2, she couldn't remember the names. But von Braun in 1952 said there had been 3. So what the other 2 were, I couldn't tell you, because my focus has been on Roswell.
So it seems that these things are bulletproof, but not bulletproof. I mean, they're capable of destruction. Lightning is nothing compared to usually what they would see in outer space or wherever they came from. So why lightning?
Anything manufactured has its tensile strength. When it's exceeded, it comes apart. And whatever happened to this craft, at Roswell, it was either an internal malfunction that blew it apart or one of these massive lightning strikes that blew it apart. So whatever it was, it blew apart.
So you have a new book coming out, and I have your book, the book that you have out right now, Wright-Patterson Eyewitness Accounts from the Real Area 51. It's a great book, but a new book coming out is called Case Closed. Do you feel that the case is closed, or do we have a ways to go on this, and can we learn more?
Well, of course, we've had a proactive investigation since 1998, Don Schmidt and I. That means what that means is that we just don't sit back waiting for somebody to call us or send us something, but that we actually go out in the field, mostly New Mexico, shaking the tree, looking for witnesses, conducting archaeological digs, things like that. And what it means to me is that the witness pool has really dried up because of the age. People, like I told you earlier, somebody 20 years old in 1947 is now 92. And so very few, if any, firsthand witnesses, participants are still left and able to talk to us. We will investigate secondhand witnesses like sons, grandsons, daughters, granddaughters, things like that. If something comes along that we are motivated to follow up on it. But I think the proactive investigation is pretty near at an end because all the primary witnesses are either dead or at a point where we can't interview them. So that book, Case Closed, will be out. Is planned on coming out in June of next year. It might be earlier. It's already finished and at the publisher. We have another book coming out. We thought it would be out by now, but it's a coffee table book, a picture book. It's about 250 pages, but it's a coffee table book of the timeline, the Roswell timeline in pictures. Now, over the 27 years that Don and I have been a team, I've taken a lot of pictures. There have been a lot of pictures taken about Roswell. And we tell the timeline in a series of bullet points and photos. It's really something. I really enjoyed putting that together. And they're color. They're in color. Most of the pictures are color, and it puts the reader like in the story because everything is in pictures. You can see who's who, what they look like. You can see this place, what it looks like. Drawings of what the aliens, what people told us they look like, the craft, you name it, it's there. And we thought it would be out by now, but the publisher ran into a little glitch there. And it will be out before this year is over, I guarantee you. And so it's called Roswell, the Chronological Pictorial. And that will be out later this year. And we think it's something different. And I know myself, when I buy a book, the first thing I do is I go to the picture section.
Yeah, me too. Just split it right in the middle and go there.
I don't know. I just go to the pictures, see what pictures they have. So
if I don't see that black line of pictures right in the middle of the pages, I don't even pick it up.
Yes. So we said, why not have a whole book like that? And we do. It's about 250 pages, so it's. And you know what coffee table books are? They're a little larger than your regular size book. So,
but until then, please go out and pick up UFO Secrets Inside Wright-Patterson Eyewitness Accounts from the Real Area 51. Tom Carey has been my guest tonight. It's an excellent read, and it's from an amazing investigator, Tom Carey. Thank you very much.
I thank you. I am humbled.
It was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun to have you here, and there's always things that I wanted to ask, and I got to ask him tonight. So again, thank you, sir, very much.
Maybe we can do it again if you have some questions.
we have hours in the future. And I can't wait to read that next book because it's one of those things that there's very few of these that I will actually pick up and read from cover to cover. And
Yes.
you are one of those authors, and there's a couple others, but I love the perspective of the anthropologist, and I love the fact in Children of Roswell you quoted Joe Friday and Franz Boas. So you have two investigators from different spectrums there, and
we put that in the front of every book we've ever done. The Joe Friday's famous for just the facts, man.
Right.
Franz Boas was I got that from one of my anthropology professors at Cal State. He said Boas said, develop enough facts and the answer will fall to you like a ripe fruit.
Yeah, it's amazing. Nice to hear that. Nice to hear the perspective from an anthropologist, because I've been accused, again, of having a lot of anthropologists on the show, and I've had a bunch. So you're the best so far. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Take
care.
My Alien Life Podcast.
You can find my website at www.myalienlifepodcast.com, and please subscribe to my latest downloads at iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, and at podbean.com. And please follow me and like me on Facebook and Twitter. My Alien Life is written and produced for broadcast at Studio 254 in the Northern Rocky Mountains. The music you are hearing is produced and created by Elion. You can find all Elion's work online at Heart Dance Records.